Have you ever wondered what traces of your life you'd leave behind in the digital world? And what it would mean if an AI could bring those traces back to life? Well, welcome to another episode of Shifting Schools. I'm your host, Jeff Utecht. In today's episode, we're diving deep into the world of AI companions and the complex ethical questions they raise, especially for educators and parents. We'll explore how AI tools designed to combat loneliness might actually increase it, and how these systems can influence teenagers' social skills and emotional development. And finally, we'll discuss the critical importance of AI literacy and why it's not just about learning to use the tools, but about understanding their social and ethical impacts. Our guest today is Tomasz Hollanek, a researcher at the Center for the Future of Intelligence at the University of Cambridge. Tomasz works at the fascinating intersection of AI ethics and critical design, focusing especially on the ethics of human-AI interaction. His recent research includes investigating AI companions, think grief bots or deadbots, and the profound implications those technologies have on society, especially in educational contexts. Get ready for an in-depth discussion and reflection on the future of AI in our lives and the lives of our students. And with that, on with the show. All right, welcome back to another Shifting Schools podcast. I'm so excited here to be with Tomasz, who's in AI ethics, critical design at Cambridge. He's also a researcher, consultant, and public speaker. Today, we're going to be talking about AI ethics, AI literacy. Tomasz, thank you so much for joining us today. Real quick for our listeners, give us a little bit about your background and why AI ethics, why AI literacy, why now?
Well, Jeff, thanks so much for having me. I'm really keen to also reach out to your audiences, educators, probably one of the most important and most underappreciated group in the AI ethics conversation. So again, thanks so much for having me. I'm a researcher at the Leverhulme Center for the Future of Intelligence at the University of Cambridge. Our center is a highly interdisciplinary center dedicated to investigating the political, social, cultural, and ethical dimensions of artificial intelligence. Our team is highly interdisciplinary, comprising computer scientists, philosophers, cultural studies scholars. My work is primarily located at the intersection of critical design and AI ethics, as you mentioned, but making it a little more concrete, what I work on primarily is on the ethics of human-AI interaction design. And more specifically, my most recent work has focused on the ethics of AI companions, including grief bots and deadbots, AI-enabled resurrections or recreations or simulations of deceased individuals. And I'm keen to talk a bit more about how these companions, and including these slightly more weirder cases of deadbots or grief bots, how they intersect with questions that I'm sure many educators might be asking themselves these days.
I think I just saw an article the other day where here in the US, we just had our first, I think, death bot in a case. I don't know, like where the person, I think, was either murdered or died or something, but there was an AI version of them talking in a court case.
Yeah, that's right. You're right. It was the first time that a victim was, in some sense, allowed to speak. Although this is really all this is all. Of course, this wasn't the person speaking for themselves, but it was the impression that someone, the victim of a murder, was able to speak for themselves in a court case. And actually, the emotional response that this generated among everyone gathered for the case points to the effective power of these systems and also potential dangers or risks that they may pose, in particular when we're thinking about emotional manipulation.
And I think that's a great place to start our conversation, because I know we are hearing a lot in the education space around things like Character.AI, where we have a lot of vulnerable teenagers who are looking to these bots as either boyfriends, girlfriends, grief companions, like you talked about, and some of the ethical issues around that, especially when we're talking about teenagers. What are your thoughts on that, or what is some of the research that's going into that kind of area right now?
Mm. A few months ago, we held a workshop in Cambridge dedicated to investigating some of these questions and again in a highly interdisciplinary with my colleague Aisha Sobi here at Cambridge. We invited around 50 technologists, psychologists, academics to discuss together some of the potential risks, also potential benefits that these technologies. So when I say these technologies, in this case specifically AI companions,
Yeah.
Character AI is one of the many examples of emerging systems that offer some form of companionship to people, including, and this is, I think, where we need to pause for a little and think about the consequences even more when we're thinking about teenagers or even younger children.
Sure.
But what I could tell you very quickly is what the experts gathered in that room collectively thought of the biggest risks that we identified collectively. I will also maybe then mention some of the potential benefits, because there are benefits that we need to be thinking about. And then I will tell you a bit more about what we thought, again, collectively, what needs to happen for these technologies to develop in a desirable direction. So in terms of the biggest risks, it's interesting because you mentioned obviously AI girlfriends, boyfriends, and this is because many of the companies that operate in this space essentially promise that they would be able to tackle the loneliness crisis. And the way loneliness itself is presented somewhat simplistically by these companies is a whole different conversation. But in essence, one of the biggest risks is that when it comes to these companions, including Character AI, one example, is that yes, these systems may offer or temporary comfort, but in the long run, they could actually replace human connections and ultimately deepen isolation. So I think when we're thinking about these emerging systems, it's really hard to not think about comparisons between these systems. So one of my colleagues at Cambridge uses this umbrella term social AI to actually make the analogy between companion chatbots and social media very visible. And so we now know that the impact of social media on the mental health of the youngest generation has been significant and negative. The evidence is, I think, not there. There may be some questions about specific correlations, but it's very clear that there is very clear evidence of the negative impact of social media on teenagers, in combination with ever-present internet connection and the ways in which applications on our mobile devices are designed. This is something that most educators are aware of. I realize this, in some ways I'm saying something obvious, but then when it comes to social AI solutions, you can imagine how the problems that we have and have had with social media could appear on steroids, basically.
Right.
And this is because, and this is pointing to the second type of risk, the risk of growing dependency that some younger people, but also adults, might develop when it comes to using these systems. The reason why the risk of dependency is higher when it comes to these types of systems is that they are designed to be human-like.
Right.
So this is a fundamental feature of their design, which actually increases the potential for emotional reliance, especially among vulnerable users. And I would say that all teenagers should be considered vulnerable users. And of course, there are individual differences. Not everyone will be negatively affected by these systems, but companies such as Replika, one of these, one provider of companion chatbots that actually allows only people over 18 to use their chatbots, I think make the right choice. And this is not the case for all of these systems.
Sure.
And there are other types of risks as well, slightly more systemic. Perhaps we could say that in many ways, these systems also oversimplify our emotional complexity. So that in many ways leads to other types of problems related to the design. They might, for instance, hinder the user's social skills. And this is something we have observed to an extent with social media.
Sure.
That younger people find it harder and harder to build in-person connections. They feel less and less comfortable just being exposed to new people in real life. And again, we can see how these systems could exacerbate this. They could also lead to the development of unrealistic relationship expectations among younger adults who didn't get a chance really to see how relationships might develop without these systems being present. So these are some of the risks. I can tell you very quickly about some potential benefits as well, which again, I'm sure that educators who are thinking about the impact of these systems might find more obvious, but some experts mention the potential benefits of these systems for social skill development. So yes, if they're designed poorly, they might lead to the opposite effect. But if they're designed responsibly and thoughtfully, they could help specific groups of teenagers think of these interactions as a training ground for real world interactions.
Well, I like that. Yeah.
So people who are, for instance, socially anxious might actually find some comfort, not in these systems as a replacement for real world interactions, but rather as a training ground for these interactions so that they feel more comfortable when they actually have to enact these forms of interactions with real people.
What I like about that is like what you're talking about is how do we leverage this technology to empower our human side rather than replace your companion, right? Instead of saying, oh, we want to use these to replace these social skills, how can we train them, develop them, leverage them to support us and empower us to overcome these, like in your case, like a social awkwardness, or there's ways that we can leverage these to empower us to be better, not replace that innate connection that I think we're afraid of and can happen if these tools aren't designed in a way that allow that to work.
Exactly. In many ways, it goes back to questioning the business model behind many of these systems, which is if your system is essentially based on keeping people hooked, right? How can it help you as a user transition to in-person interactions? So in some ways, thinking about the ethical design of these systems is really thinking about the ethical business decision-making behind these systems. So in some sense, AI ethics is really a form of business ethics in that sense. And I do feel that actually responsible regulation of this space could help steer the industry in that direction. And I can tell you actually a bit more about what we're thinking.
Are we seeing any regulation come through around this right now? Or do we still feel like a lot of the regulating bodies are still just like hands off and let's see what happens before we put the brakes on this?
We have seen the emergence of the first comprehensive piece of legislation in the EU that tries to comprehensively regulate AI systems, including the kinds of systems that we're discussing now. So actually, so I'm talking right now about the AI Act and the European Union, which essentially divides AI systems into different tiers of risks that they might pose. So we have systems that are considered prohibited because of the prohibited nature of the risk that they might pose. And then we have high risk systems. Then we have limited risk systems. And then finally, we have whatever the final category is, like negligible risk, essentially. Most chatbots, unfortunately, fall under the limited risk category, which is somewhat paradoxical because at the same time, what the AI Act prohibits is the development of systems that are fundamentally manipulative. But then when you actually start to analyze the regulation, you realize that understanding what manipulation means is difficult. In particular, when the regulator actually assumes that in some cases, manipulation might be permissible if the person is agreeing to the manipulation. So this is actually something that we are working on at Cambridge now to figure out what that provision might mean in practice and how it could be used as a loophole for systems that, for instance, offer mental health services, because that's explicitly mentioned by the Act. If you consent to being manipulated in some sense, perhaps the emerging system should be allowed to to be released on the market. And actually, this points to the main question, which I feel educators should be thinking about, and I'm sure are thinking about, which is the question of consent and whether younger people are or are not old enough to consent to various things. As you probably know, in the US, when it comes to considering whether a person is old enough to consent to certain forms of data use, basically after you're 13, the assumption is that you can consent to. So this is why teenagers in the US can use Facebook, for instance.
Right.
And I guess one of the ways in which regulators could steer the industry in the right direction is actually by rethinking that specific bit, where we're thinking about what does it mean for teenagers and other vulnerable populations to meaningfully consent to interacting with such systems.
Yeah. In the UK, what is it in the EU? Because it is 13 here. We have the 13 rule. In the EU, is it at 18? Is there an age like we do here in the US? Is it different in the EU?
So it will be different in different countries.
Okay.
As far as I know, there isn't a standard age across the EU. Although I should also say that I'm not a legal expert.
Yeah.
So I don't
no legal experts here. This is just us talking.
I'm thinking more, if anything, I'm thinking about how some of the existing regulation might be daunting for developers and how we might use specific tools to help developers translate the requirements, for instance, of the AI Act into practice. So I haven't, anyway, but yeah, the age will differ under different jurisdictions, but I wouldn't want to give you a definitive answer as it applies to the EU, because I'm not sure about this.
Okay.
And consent, actually, since I mentioned consent and I'm saying that I'm working more on the design side of things, I can give you an example of what does it mean, not from the legal point of view, but from the design point of view about consent and how we can elicit consent meaningfully when we're designing such systems. What we have been thinking about here at Cambridge, and also with some partners actually working for AI companies, is how we can rethink the mechanism for consent elicitation and for consent affirmation when we're interacting with such systems, but in general digital systems. So usually what happens is you express your consent once when you begin the interaction, right? This is what usually happens. So we're now thinking of the idea of recurring consent. So something that you're prompted to reaffirm as circumstances change, or just essentially as you keep using a system. Ways in which we could ask for that consent in a way that makes sure that the user reaffirms that consent meaningfully, which is not easy. And it's also not so easy to design this mechanism in a way that is not disruptive, in a way that actually makes the user feel more frustrated about the process.
I keep thinking, as you're talking, all I can imagine is the little cookie thing that pops up at the bottom of every website right now. Just remember, there are cookies on this. Do you consent to these cookies? Do you consent to these cookies? I could see just to help people that are listening, you're almost talking about every time you interact with an AI like this, there might be something like that of, do you still give consent? Understand this is what's going on. Do you still give consent? This is what's going on. Do you understand what's going on? Do you give consent? It's going to be that. But to your point, you have to do it in a way that doesn't seem like it's annoying or that it's not in your face all the time.
And most importantly, not something that you just forget about.
Yeah, that you just click on and click on and say whatever.
So
without really knowing what's happening.
Ways in which you can imagine this could happen. For instance, if you ask the user, how often would you like to be asked? Also, you can think of ways of linking these questions to AI literacy and how companies should be responsible for ensuring that users are AI literate when they make decisions about their interactions with the system. So for instance, you can see how, again, this is another part of the issue where when you're signing up as a user to, for instance, I don't know, like we could be talking about ChatGPT.
Sure.
You're only informed about potential risks or potential issues when it comes to using these systems once, again, when you start the interaction, when you sign up. Of course, there is a permanent disclaimer. Most of these generative AI systems, conversational AI systems have a permanent disclaimer. Be careful. Actually, what the system gives you might not be accurate. So please check. But of course, when it's permanently there, you stop seeing it. There are ways in which we can imagine we need to reimagine how consent and disclaimers are designed differently to make sure that users are really meaningfully consenting to whatever it is that they're using.
Yeah.
And of course, when it comes to children or teenagers, it becomes even more important to make sure that they really know what it is that they're interacting with, so that they do not, for instance, develop a misleading perception of what it is that they're interacting with.
Well, and I think that's a great segue into this idea of AI literacy.
Hey listeners, a quick pause before we dive back in. We've been exploring the future of work all summer long, and one thing's become very clear. We can't talk about what's next without supporting students where they are right now. And as school mental health budgets are seeing severe cuts, safe and scalable solutions to reach more students with fewer resources are critical. That's why we're excited to highlight our partners at Alongside, an AI-assisted mental health skill-building tool that is built especially for K-12 schools. It is the only evidence-based tool of its kind, and their brand new 2025 Youth Mental Health Report is now live. It features insights from over 250,000 anonymous student chats from the past school year. You'll learn why teens say sleep is one of their biggest struggles, what's fueling the crisis in school-life balance, how boys are quietly learning to ask for help, why confidential AI-guided support is resonating, and how schools are using it to reach students early, safely. Curious to see how it works for yourself? Educators can set up a free demo account and try Alongside anytime. Just head to www.alongside.care/shifting to download the report or to start your free demo to explore the platform hands-on. We're proud to have Alongside as a partner this summer, and even prouder to help shine a light on how they're making preventative mental health support for students and staff safe, affordable, and accessible to every student, even in the face of severe budget cuts and staffing shortages. The link is in the show notes, or again, you can head straight to alongside.care/shifting. Now, back to the conversation.
What is the feeling amongst researchers right now around this idea of AI literacy, especially with children right now? We are, for better or for worse, as educators, preparing the next generation of kiddos that are going to be, whether we want it to be or not. And as I keep telling educators, nobody's putting this genie back in the bottle, right?
Yeah.
And what is it that we really need to be focused in on when we talk about AI literacy, these kind of conversations, or what are we seeing happening? Where should we be focusing this idea of AI literacy right now with students as we start thinking about the forward momentum of this stuff?
Actually, Audrey Tang, so the former digital minister of Taiwan, makes this important distinction between literacy and competence building. And of course, this is just semantics, really, because
Sure.
literacy could mean that. But that distinction is interesting because it differentiates between passive skills and the kinds of ways of learning that enable more active participation. So, for instance, I would say that educators should be themselves actually thinking about how they can participate in the decision-making process around these tools. So this, we can think on like a granular local level where educators should have a meaningful say in how specific systems are introduced in their local school ecosystem. So this is local governors, whoever is running the school system in the district should really listen to educators, parents, and children. And so this is where children should be seriously considered stakeholders in the decision-making process, both when it comes to designing the technologies, but also deploying them. So that's like one thing. But of course, for that to happen, everyone has to be at least aware of what AI systems actually are and how they're working.
Yeah.
And that is a little more complicated and will depend on the level, the educational level that we're talking about. But if I had to stress like one thing, it would be not to focus so much on making sure that everyone knows how to use AI systems, how to apply them, because very often AI literacy gets misinterpreted as this, as essentially skill development.
Right.
So making sure that everyone knows how to prompt engineer. But what we need to think about more is actually the social and ethical dimensions as a fundamental, integral part of the education process around AI and other technologies. If I had to give you an example from the kind of field that I'm thinking about right now, which is, I mentioned earlier, grief bots, deadbots. So systems that essentially try to simulate deceased individuals. And by the way, I should say, like, for educators, there are potential beneficial applications as well, which we can discuss in a second. But anyway, thinking about these systems, for instance, you can imagine how you can use them as material to discuss in class what it is that remains after we die, but also when we're alive. What kind of traces do we leave behind in the digital world? And so thinking about our legacy and our digital footprint is something that educators, this is something that kids should be introduced to very early on, I think.
Yeah.
Of course, this relates to the question of privacy, which I'm sure educators are already aware of, and trying to make clear to students that once you put something out there, it stays forever. But linking this to new challenges as they emerge in the AI space, and deadbots are a particularly interesting one. I think that would be a priority. So essentially, yeah, thinking about the social and ethical dimensions, not just skills development.
Yeah, and I think I love that, because I think you are correct. A lot of times when we think of AI literacy, I think a lot of educators automatically go to the idea of skill development and not the overall literacy of what do these tools do. One place where I'm finding a lot of traction, especially with students, is we have a generation of kids in our schools right now that are very climate aware. And some of those social ideas that you're talking about is the impact that these machines are having on our climate, whether that is our electrical grids or the amount of water that it is taking to cool the servers. I am finding that is a great ethical issue, a social ethical issue that this generation of kids is willing to dig into and actually think about. Not all the time do we get kids to actually want to think deeply about the stuff we think about, but that is one of those places where I have been able to see students stop and think and reflect on their use of AI when they start to understand there is an environmental impact to this stuff.
Yeah.
And I think that's just one of those like small areas that we need to be having these conversations with these students around. Yes, you can go and make funny memes with any of these LLMs that you want, but every time you create an image, there is an environmental impact behind. Just because you're having fun and you're screwing around, there's an environmental impact to that somewhere down the line. And just be aware of that, right? Be aware of what that might mean for you. So I think that's just one of those areas where you're at. I keep thinking about, the work that you're doing with these grief bots and death bots. And there's a project that I'm starting to work on, and I haven't even mentioned it yet on the podcast, but I've had a couple of people reach out to me around supporting our indigenous tribes here in the United States, where we have a lot of indigenous tribes where there are fewer and fewer people who are speaking the indigenous language. And we're in a place now where we are starting to lose those indigenous languages. And these indigenous tribes are starting to think about, well, how do we capture this? How do we make sure this moves forward? And I'm almost wondering, is that something where on the positive side of these kind of death bots, like we could basically make a bot that is the chief of these indigenous tribes from years past who still speak the language, who can tell those stories, who you could interact with and understand the stories of the tribe. And is that kind of some of the stuff that on the positive end, is that some of the things that we're thinking about could come out of these?
There are some amazing projects that actually focus on preserving languages, but also just making sure it's not only about preserving, but really diversifying. LLMs don't work so well for certain types of languages because not all languages are codified in a way that actually allows us to train new models on the kind of data, because the kind of data that a model would need to be trained on does not exist. And there are some projects focusing on that, a few amazing projects in several actually African countries. I can send you a link later. I don't know if you can share it, but
Yeah, I'd
we've
love
had
that.
some amazing presentations here in Cambridge at a conference, Many Worlds of AI, some time ago. But so that's one thing. Yes, the idea of deadbots or postmortem avatars as different ways of preserving community memory. Yes, that's definitely one potential path. I would say it really is up to the community to decide whether they feel comfortable or not with that means of preserving a specific community's legacy or cultural memory. But there are some very interesting projects. And again, like for educators, I'm sure that would be an interesting potential path to explore. Projects that look at how we can use these systems to preserve the memories of Holocaust survivors. We don't have so many of them that are still alive. And as many of them really feel like they need to pass on their testimony.
Yeah.
Even though when they're very old, they still keep on meeting younger generations because they feel it's so essential that there is this, that their testimonies is passed on. And several different foundations are working on this with Holocaust survivors who are still alive, who are also willing for their biographies or memories to be preserved in this way. And so there is definitely this potential path for sure. Yeah.
I really like that. As you look towards the future, because I'm sure a lot of the research you're looking at, I'm even looking behind you on the board, it says 2025 and I see 6, 7, 8, 9. As we start thinking in the future, if you push this out to say 2030, 5 years from now, or 2035, 10 years from now, where do you think this is headed? Like where, from an ethical standpoint, from a AI in our lives standpoint, how do we make sure we're not, and I mean, I'm sure these are a lot of the questions that you're going through is like, how do we make sure we don't make the same mistakes we did with social media around not understanding the social implications that this had on us as individuals and us in society? Where do you see all of this kind of heading? Or are there talks about what the future of this all looks like?
There definitely are many conversations, and actually at my research center, there is a team dedicated to thinking about the long-term risks posed by AI FAR, Futures and Responsibility. That's the team that is working on these long-term, potential, somewhat speculative issues. I feel like it's important to think about the long future or far future and long-term risks for sure. But we have to be very careful when we talk about long-term risks, because so often they do misdirect our attention from what is happening now already.
Right.
We do need to think about what will happen to our society when these systems are rolled out, like for instance, when we think about deadbots on a bigger scale. But I do feel that actually, and this is what I do in my work, like I am more interested in what is happening now.
Yeah.
And when it comes to speculation, I think of it more as a tool to actually, speculative design is a practice that I'm interested in, where non-professional designers, because we're all designers in some ways, are encouraged to imagine what they would see as desirable. So this is a method that educators could consider, like encouraging students to imagine their own Black Mirror scenarios, essentially, as an exercise for thinking about what it is that we want now, not in the future. So for me, speculation and thinking about the future is always about what we need to do now. And I feel like speculation can be that amazing tool that empowers people to feel like actually they do have something to say, that they are experts of their own experience, and they might not be AI engineers, but they do have good and valid and important ideas for how these technologies should be rolled out right now. And I'm thinking in particular about teachers, but also students.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think to your point, when we're talking about these, I love that idea of what do we need now from this technology, especially because we're still in hyper innovation stage where these things are just, they're moving so quickly right now. It's hard to really keep wrapping your head. And as two gentlemen who are in this space all the time, it's hard to wrap our head around how fast this stuff is moving, let alone if this is not your space, right? If you're not really into tech or you're not into thinking about AI and what that leveraging these tools looks like. I think the other thing to be thinking about is when we talk about this idea of AI companions, a lot of times we're still thinking in the concept of it's a chatbot on your phone or it's an app that you're going to download. But we're already seeing cases where this idea of an AI companion is showing up in our physical forms of other ways. Like I know they're already creating these AI companions made for very young children that are like a teddy bear.
Sure.
And your parents literally buy you a teddy bear that has the equivalent of ChatGPT built into it. That is, its job is to be your companion, to read you your bedtime stories, to help you with your homework. And it's not even on a computer screen. It's something physical in your space. And I think it's good for people to understand. And to your point, is be thinking about what does that mean for us now as we think about the future of raising children, the future of what do we want when it's not just computer screens, but it's literally physical things in our environment that are going to be companions with us that might have this technology embedded.
I just feel like it's really important to stress that these futures are not and cannot be determined by industry objectives.
Yeah.
And so what that means is that as citizens, as educators, as users, we need to mobilize to voice our concerns, but also to propose alternatives in many ways. This is not to say that the weight of responsibility should be on teachers only, for instance, or only parents, but it is about realizing that we need to be building coalitions and that we at least in a democratic systems, there are ways in which we can affect the way politics is happening.
Yeah.
And so that's my main point here really is that what happens with AI and how the future of AI is being determined is not only up to technologists based in the Silicon Valley, right?
Sure.
So that's what that would be my main sort of point for educators, to feel empowered that yes, they have something important to say and and I know that they're overburdened at the same time.
Yeah.
There has to be a balance between these two systemic issues.
Yeah.
So yeah, but this is why I think what you're doing is great, because it helps people hopefully in a user-friendly way to get up to speed.
Yeah. And to be critically aware, I think this is a time for our audience here of educators and parents to just critically be aware of these things that are going on, to understand there are researchers like yourself who are thinking about these issues that we need to be paying attention to. I highly recommend that people follow Tomasz on LinkedIn. Great LinkedIn profile, and the stuff that you're sharing and the research that is happening with you in Cambridge around ethical design and critical design. I think it's just, we need to stay in these spaces. And I think one of the things that I'm hoping, specifically in education, we learned from social media is burying your head in the sand and pretending like it's not going to impact you or it's not going to impact your students. Doesn't work. We tried that once and look where we are now with social media. We've got to be able to take a look at these things, to ask these hard questions, to engage with researchers and researching bodies like yourself. And really, to your point, hold these companies accountable and ask the difficult questions and be thoughtful when we use these technologies with our students. And at the same time, understand that there's some really great, powerful things that can come from this. It's not all bad. There's going to be some incredible things. And we're already seeing it, right? Throughout education, throughout some of their impacts, incredible uses of these tools. And so it's how do we minimize the risk and gain as much reward as possible in the sectors that we are in? I thank you so much for taking some time today to come on the podcast and talk to us. And if nothing else, to expose our listeners to you, to the work that you and your colleagues are doing. I just want to commend you and say thank you for doing this work. It's so great when we have things like LinkedIn, again, a social media platform that we all like to hate on social media right now. And yet here are these platforms that connect us and allow us to share these ideas and get you on the podcast to talk about some of these ethical issues and some things that like grief bots and post-mortem bots that people probably haven't heard of or haven't even given a thought to yet, that we do need to be critically thinking about these with our kiddos. And what are the ethical concerns, and continue to have these AI literacy ethical conversations with our kids, I think is going to be critical to raising the next generation in a world of generative AI. Whatever that world looks like in the future, we've got to start these conversations now so that they are critically consumers and critical thinkers of this information. As we get ready to sign off, other than your LinkedIn profile, which I'll make sure is linked into the show notes, are there other websites that maybe people should go to, or other ways they can follow you, or other places educators should go to keep up on these conversations that are happening?
If anyone is interested, we have an online-based toolkit for journalists on AI. But I would say that this toolkit might also be a great resource for educators, where you can really find a lot of information about what AI is, what it isn't, that is really meant for non-experts. So that's one of these resources that Cambridge put together that might be relevant to your audience.
Yeah, that'd be great. Very cool. Awesome.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity. And if any of your listeners is interested in working with us at Cambridge, or interested in following up on anything I said in more detail, we're always very open to engaging with people that actually, work in the real world with some of the questions that sometimes we tend to theorize.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. Thank you for putting that out there. Appreciate it. Thomas, thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciate it. And thanks for sharing here on Shifting Schools.
Hey folks, thank you again for tuning into this week's episode. I want to let you know that if this conversation has you feeling curious about the future, you can join me for a free 45-minute webinar coming up July 17th. That's going to be at 8 a.m. MDT, 10 a.m. EST, or 3 p.m. GMT. That free 45-minute webinar, July 17th, is going to be exploring futures literacy to help us better understand emerging career pathways. Futures literacy is a huge passion of mine, and I will be showing you how you can use it to better imagine multiple futures. We will dig into existing signals. These are clues about where the future world of work might be headed. And we'll also dig into some of the trends. These are evidence-backed pieces of research that show us something is shifting. If you'd like to join me for that free 45-minute webinar, you can register at www.shiftingschools.com. Hope to see you July 17th.
Hey there, dedicated listener. If you've made it this far, we know you're passionate about shifting the way education works. And Tricia and I appreciate you. If you loved what you heard today, we'd be so grateful if you could take a moment to rate and review Shifting Schools wherever you listen to podcasts. Those ratings help us reach even more educators just like you. And if you know someone who could benefit from these conversations, please share this episode with them. Just one person. Think of the impact we can make together. Don't forget to sign up for our newsletter for even more great content. And if you haven't already, join us at Camp Shifting Schools, where the conversations keep going long after the podcasts end. Thank you for being a part of this journey, and thank you for being part of Shifting Schools.